the AUKUS submarine deal is a symptom, I think, rather than a cause of the ills of Australia's relationship with the United States, which has involved Australia following the United States into almost every war it has fought since the end of the Second World War, no matter when and no matter why, and doing so enthusiastically.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. And over the weekend, America's supposedly isolationist president joined Israel's war against Iran, dropping bombs on 3 Iranian nuclear sites.
Tonight I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success.
Thanks to President Trump's bold and visionary leadership and his commitment to peace through strength, Iran's nuclear ambitions have been obliterated.
The Defense Intelligence Agency has assessed that the core components of Iran's nuclear program are largely intact, and that Iran's nuclear program has essentially only been set back by months.
You know what? We basically have 2 countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
Writing in Guardian Australia, international law expert Don Rothwell said the bombing has no legitimacy in international law. Despite this, the Australian government fell in behind the United States.
The world has long agreed that Iran cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon.
And we support action to prevent that, and that is what this is.
Though apparently this was not strong enough for the coalition or some in the Conservative press.
I think the Prime Minister has been too slow, too silent and too passive.
Joining me today to talk about the conflict and what it means for Australia is Director of the International and Security Affairs Program at the Institute, Dr. Emma Shortis. G'day, Emma.
Hey, Eb.
And joining us back on the show is Allan Behm, Senior Advisor in the International and Security Affairs Program. G'day, Allan.
Good afternoon, Eb.
So, Allan, this time last week, you and I were chatting about the risks of escalation in this conflict. And on Sunday morning Australian time, we really got our answer. What could this United States decision to bomb Iran mean for security in the region?
I think it is fundamentally a disaster for the security of the Middle East, and it's probably equally a disaster for global security. Because what it represents is the United States, once again, deciding that it will go after a country and bomb it, shock and awe-like, without having any legal justification to do that. And the moment you step beyond the law, then you are denying the ultimate foundation of global security. So that's why I think it is a fundamental disaster for everybody.
Mm. Emma, Donald Trump says he's negotiated a ceasefire, though that sounded like it might have been news to Iran. Even if one does come into force, do you think there's really any chance of it lasting at this point?
Well, I mean, almost nothing Donald Trump does lasts in that sense, does it? You know, he announced this ceasefire, as you said, Eb, on Truth Social, and it quickly became clear that Iran had not signed up for it, was possibly not even aware of this agreement that, you know, Trump had called peaceful and respectful. And it's worth remembering that, you know, really even just in the 24 hours before that, Trump was speculating about regime change in Iran, also on Truth Social. So, you know, the broad lesson out of that is that nothing the president says is consistent or reliable. And I think it's very likely that the same thing will apply to this ceasefire if it even does come into effect. And I think that's where Allan's point is so important, because this so fundamentally undermines the principles of international law that any ceasefire has to be regarded in that context, that it isn't an agreement that adheres to the principles of international law, nor one that has a view to long-term security and long-term peace building. Trump has told us all he's really interested in is winning the Nobel Peace Prize. That's what he cares about. He doesn't care about the long-term security or stability of the region.
Well, they should give you the Nobel Prize for Rwanda and if you look the Congo, or you could say Serbia, Kosovo, you could say a lot of them. You could say, the big one is India and Pakistan. I should have gotten it 4 or 5 times. I should get it for I would think the Abraham Accords would be a good one too. But they won't give me a Nobel Peace Prize because they only give it to liberals.
Allan, do we know much about how Israel's original bombing of Iran and now the United States bombing of Iran has impacted on Iran's military or its nuclear capacity at the moment?
I think it is fair to say that Israel's initial set of operations against Iran were pretty successful. They would appear to have done very great damage to Iran's self-defense capability, not least of all because we saw the American bombers and the F-35s go in totally unimpeded, deliver all their ordnance and go home again without a scratch. So it does look as though Iran has very little left by way of defence against bombing. What it means for Iran's nuclear capabilities, I think, is equally uncertain. And the reason for that is that Iran's pretty canny and crafty in the way in which it's been able to maintain this capability over a very long time now. And I'd be most surprised if they hadn't moved a lot of their nuclear materials somewhere else apart from the 3 facilities which were evidently going to be targets. In fact, they could have put them in a tent out in the middle of the desert and just left them there, I think, because so long as nobody knew much about it, they would have been safe enough for a day or two. So I don't know what impact it's really had on Iran's nuclear capability. I think, though, that it will have driven a much stronger level of resolve on the part of the Iranians to get a nuclear capability. And I would be very surprised if they don't redouble their efforts now to move ahead with a faster process, that is, do more of it, enrichment of 60% to 90% enrichment levels for uranium so that they can assemble some bombs, because once they've got a couple of nuclear weapons, it becomes an altogether different sort of a military equation. And we won't see B-2s armed with bunker busters going in to take out a state with nuclear weapons.
Yeah. I guess my follow-up question then, Allan, is what do you think this means for nuclear proliferation overall in the rest of the world, not just for Iran?
I think it is a very sad thing, Ebony, that we're virtually in a free fire zone when it comes to nuclear proliferation. A lot of countries are now talking about acquiring nuclear weapons. It's very clear that the war in Ukraine has legitimised both the possession and the use of nuclear weapons. If one hears what Lavrov and Putin have got to say, if one reads the current American nuclear weapons posture statement, where nuclear weapons are now legitimately to be used in conventional conflicts. They talk about them as theatre weapons, but the escalation ladder between theatre weapons and much bigger megaton range nuclear weapons is a very, very short one, I think. So when you've got countries in Asia, some countries in Europe now beginning to rethink their position, Iran thinking that it might now drop out of the NPT, I think it is a time when countries such as Australia and our traditional non-proliferation colleagues got very much more active in pressing the case for an effective nuclear non-proliferation regime. So in all of this, it's gloomy days for nuclear non-proliferation, I think.
Emma, the pretense really for this whole military strike against Iran was about its nuclear program. But then, as you mentioned, Donald Trump has kind of been posting about regime change. How much is it about non-proliferation and how much is it about regime change, do you reckon?
I think it's a really good question, Eb, and it's a difficult one to answer, to kind of pull apart, I suppose, all of the motivations. But I think in answering the question, the historical context is really important for a number of reasons. The first is that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been talking up the imminent threat of the Iranian nuclear program for decades. You know, there's vision of him going before the US Congress in the 1990s and saying similar things, you know, that Iran was a month away from developing a nuclear weapon. So he has been angling for these kinds of attacks against Iran and American involvement in those attacks for a long time. The difference being that presidents before the one we have now were reluctant or unwilling, really, to be drawn into that conflict for very good reason.
I certainly empathize with Americans who are exhausted after 25 years of foreign entanglements in the Middle East. I understand the concern, but the difference is that back then we had dumb presidents, and now we have a president who actually knows how to accomplish America's national security objectives. So this is not going to be some long, drawn-out thing.
Vice President J.D. Vance recently described all of those presidents as dumb presidents. That's why that we can trust that President Trump has all of this in hand, which is kind of terrifying to think about. So, you know, I think you're right to identify the nuclear issue as a pretense. It's one that's always existed, but we now have a president who's, you know, willing to accept it and to use it. But that is happening in the context of this desire on the part of Netanyahu, but also many figures in Washington, in and around the Trump administration, who have wanted to pursue regime change in Iran for a very long time, really since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which was widely perceived, particularly amongst conservative, you know, right-wing circles, as the quote-unquote loss of Iran from the American sphere of influence. So that's the context in which this is operating. But it also seems to be a very kind of Trumpian motivation, in that there are reports emerging that in the lead up to Trump's decision to go in, the president was spending a lot of time watching Fox News, you know, which was full of wall-to-wall praise for Israel's attacks against Iran that he wanted in on. There wasn't coverage of the risks that Allan outlined in terms of, you know, creating further instability and insecurity in the region. And so Trump was caught up, as he often is, in that Fox News angle, and all of that, I think, has pushed him towards intervention. And again, you know, the nuclear program was, I suppose, a useful pretense. And again, you know, that's where we're seeing history really repeat itself, in that the United States has gone in to this conflict in the Middle East with no really clear objectives or plan for victory or plan for what comes afterwards. And, you know, we know from recent experience what the result of that can be.
Yes, not known for his long-term strategic thinking, Donald Trump. But I did want to ask you, before I kind of move on to domestic politics here, I mean, there's a huge faction within Donald Trump's kind of MAGA Republicans that is much more isolationist, and prior to these strikes was really, you know, on the side of not getting involved in another war, a forever war in the Middle East. How come those people didn't win out? Is it just that influence of Fox News? Are the hawks within the administration? Is it, you know, the good old military industrial complex just kind of flexing its might there?
I think that's definitely part of it. You can never underestimate the strength and the influence of that military industrial complex on the direction that the United States takes, almost, you know, no matter who is in charge. But I think, you know, your question about the MAGA coalition in particular is an interesting one, because there is that branch of the coalition that is genuinely anti-war. It's the libertarian wing, I suppose, of that coalition, you know, from which Tulsi Gabbard came originally, though she has flipped now. This is the director of national intelligence in the Trump administration. But that wing of the coalition was always, I think, a relatively small one with not a huge amount of influence. And Trump was, he's always willing to sideline people and change his opinions and positions really as it suits him. And I think, we keep expecting that the things Trump does will hurt him, that his trashing of the economy or his taking of, returning of the United States to the Middle East will hurt him with the base, and it keeps not hurting him. And I think that's partly because of his remarkable ability to reframe what he is doing to convince his base that, he alone can fix it, that he does have this cult-like status which allows him to contradict himself constantly. It allows him to lie constantly and not face any consequences for it. And, we're seeing that play out in real time, and the dangers of that for not just Americans, but for the rest of the world. I think it's worth stating, though, that what he is doing is deeply unpopular. Polling has come back that suggests that somewhere between 60 to 80% of Americans are opposed to American involvement in this conflict.
Wow.
Yeah, they're pretty extraordinary numbers, and I guess once again reflect the complete disconnect between the democratic will of the American people and what the administration is doing.
But how much is this literally for Trump just a distraction from the destruction, I guess, of civil liberties and constitutional law in the United States and from domestic politics in general? Look over here, so that we're not paying attention, to the protests or any of the hideous things he's doing domestically.
I mean, I think Trump is a master of distraction. We know that, he is a master media manipulator. He almost literally kind of produced his way into the White House. But I think we have to view all of what he is doing in that context. His taking of the United States into another war, despite the fact that, technically he needs congressional approval to do this, has to be viewed in the same context as the way he is undermining the rule of law in sending Marines into Los Angeles, for example, or in arbitrarily deporting people without allowing them recourse to due process. That undermining of those democratic systems and the rule of law is all happening in that context. And I think that's where it's important to say, we can't draw those arbitrary lines between the way he's undermining the rule of law domestically and the way he's doing it internationally, because they're deeply connected.
Yeah. Allan, the Australian government came out in support of the US bombing. What did you make of their response?
Exercise in pathos, really. The government is caught between the issues around legality, and I have no doubt that the Foreign Minister would be perfectly well aware of the illegal nature of the United States bombing of Iran, as she would be aware of the illegal nature of the Bush bombing of Iraq in 2003. And we've had all sorts of inquiries, the Chilcot inquiry in Britain, looking at the illegality of the Blair government's choice to support that. We didn't have one here, but there's nobody that I know of any status who thinks that the Australian participation in Iraq was other than illegal. And so we're seeing the same thing play out again. On the other hand, the government is just totally unprepared to put even a sliver between itself and what now passes for the opposition on national security issues.
This is a world governed by might and not right, and anyone who talks about this rules-based global order is really being nostalgic.
What do you mean by nostalgic? I mean, the rules-based order is kind of instrumental, isn't it, to the world being able to function properly? Shouldn't we expect that our closest ally adheres to the rules?
Sure. I'd love to see a world that's orderly, where everyone is prosperous and everyone is secure, but I'm also a realist. And what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years is countries like Russia and Iran and China in our own region challenge the US rules-based global order.
So you have Andrew Hastie standing up and telling us that, we've got to go with the United States because that's where our real allegiances lie, even when it acts illegally. And then tells us that if you're worried about that, you're only overcome by nostalgia, that issues of morality are sort of old hat now, It's all about power. But of course, I don't think Andrew Hastie's old enough to know what nostalgia is. I do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this hasn't been universally greeted as, the right thing to do. As we've pointed out, there's been plenty of experts pointing out that this is against international law, but the Australian's Foreign Affairs editor, Greg Sheridan, didn't love this for different reasons, writing that the government's, quote, weasel words have made us irrelevant. Allan, why are some on the right so obsessed with going all in with the United States, regardless of what they do, regardless of, how terribly, for example, the very recent war in Iraq and Afghanistan went? What's really motivating this blind adherence to all the way with the USA?
Well, it's an old phenomenon, Ebony. I mean, it goes back a hell of a long way. It was there when we went to Korea. It was there when Australia committed itself to Vietnam. It was there, obviously, when we committed ourselves to the first Afghan war, although I might say that was legal in my opinion. Certainly we committed ourselves to Iraq with alacrity and to the second Afghan war, both of which were illegal. And I think it comes down to two highly conjoined issues. One is that we see no future for our security other than with the United States, that the United States defines Australia's long-term security. And closely linked to that is that definition of our security defines us too. It's about our identity. And so I think for the pro-American right in Australia, they conflate two really critical elements of our national makeup. That is that constant desire for security and reassurance that is, I think, one of the deep pathologies in Australia. And the other, that difficulty we have in defining our own identity except by virtue of a great and powerful friend. And when you bring those two things together, you've got a very powerful motivation for the kinds of positions that the Australian newspaper advocates, but more importantly, the kinds of positions that successive governments actually adopt. And I think that is very worrying for us at the moment, when Trump is in fact turning on its head the very nature of our long-term relationship with the United States. So we've got a lot of catching up to do in our minds before we really think through how we remain a partner of the United States, because that I think is inevitable, but with a much higher level of self-direction, a much higher measure of control over the way in which our relationship with the United States should be transacted. Very difficult questions, though.
Yeah. Emma, I want to come back to those comments from Andrew Hastie that Allan mentioned earlier. So asked if an illegal bombing of Iran sets a dangerous precedent, he, as acting Foreign Affairs spokesperson, basically said, yeah, anyone who talks about the rules-based global order is really being nostalgic. I mean, what does it mean for Australia and our debate and our adherence to the rules-based order when one of our major parties, although much closer to a minor party now, is kind of advancing this argument without seeming any shame about it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's extraordinary for a number of reasons, Eb. I think you're right to point out, it's extraordinary partly because the coalition is largely irrelevant now to what the government does because of that federal election result. And yet figures like Hastie are still framing, the way that we talk about foreign policy and particularly, what the government feels like it needs to respond to. And in that context, the statements are, I suppose, even more extraordinary because, the question we have to ask in response to that is, how does Australia survive in a might is right world? I think in Hastie's mind, as Allan was outlining, that means tying ourselves ever closer to the United States. So relying on the might of the United States to ensure our security, even as it is catastrophically undermining global security through its trashing of the principles of international law. So the two things that Australia has relied on, the American security umbrella and the international rule of law, are now at the most unreliable and unstable point that they have been for a really long time. And that doesn't seem like the best way to think about the future of Australia's security. And it's also incredibly ungenerous, because what does a might is right world mean for our neighbours in the Pacific, for example? And what does that mean for regional security?
It's all quite bleak, but I also was listening to the comments from Andrew Wilkie this morning, who was basically just giving the very, what I thought sounded common sense response of, you know, you can't just go around bombing other countries. Like, it's essentially, you know, that's really all it boils down to. But that coming from an independent member of the crossbench rather than the opposition, or indeed it's not the argument or the policy being advanced by the Australian government itself. It really, you know, as you said, for Australia and our security, does it make us more or less safe, Emma?
I think it quite evidently makes us less safe. And I think it's worth pointing out that Allan actually wrote about this beautifully in the Guardian this week, where he wrote about not only, you know, the insecurity that this creates, but also the lack of moral leadership that we are seeing, not just, I think, from the leaders of this country, but leaders all over the world, you know, who are unwilling to say the most basic of things, like that these actions, these attacks are illegal. You know, as you said in the introduction, they have no legitimacy in international law. And the failure to say that is a moral failure and is a failure to live up to the promise of the UN Charter, you know, which Australia supports and has supported for a long time. And all of that, I think, undermines our security and our ability to be a moral leader in the world, which is desperately crying out for that kind of leadership.
Yeah, Allan, you and I touched on this last week as well, that real moral dimension of leadership. Obviously, we've got, you know, legal experts saying this is against international law, but they're really, that moral aspect of leadership just is absent. Is that your assessment?
I think that along with the dehumanisation of current military operations, we've seen the dehumanisation of operations in Palestine quite evidently, and there's no discussion of the human consequences of dropping bombs all over Iran. And once you dehumanise warfare, you lose your moral compass immediately, because morality is a quality, it's a human quality. And if you're without morality, or if you consider morality to in some way be superfluous or simply a question of nostalgia, then you actually have no compass whatsoever. You are intellectually and, in that proper sense, morally bankrupt, because morality is also a feature of the way in which you think about the human condition. And as you know, Ebony, when we were talking last week, we drew attention to the preambular paragraphs of the UN Charter, which just say in a crystal clear way that human beings have value and dignity by virtue of their shared humanity. And the moment you lose sight of that, you've lost sight of the fundamental engine of morality. And if you're no longer a moral person, then in many respects you're Nietzsche's last man. And that is only to welcome that kind of ultimate annihilation. So we've got to rediscover this quite quickly, because we do have in our hands the means of our own annihilation as a race, not just climate, but nuclear weapons as well.
Yeah. Allan, do you think the government is worried about speaking up, at least in part because it could risk this AUKUS deal, which looks increasingly flimsy?
I think they hide behind the AUKUS deal. I would be really surprised if people as intelligent as our current government, and they are intelligent people, really believe the nonsense around AUKUS, or that anything that they're likely to do is going to make AUKUS more achievable. In fact, I think I would argue right now that Trump's actions with respect to Iran have made AUKUS much less achievable, because smart operators like Elbridge Colby are going to say, well, we are looking forward to a prolonged period of global instability. The threats to the United States will increase. We're going to need submarines for our own purposes so that they can fire 30 or 40 cruise missiles at whoever we feel like firing them. So it'll be pretty tough for the Australians to get their 5 or 8 boats. So I just think that the AUKUS thing at this point is a fading dream, and for the Australian government right now, a much better policy would be to go back and rediscover the principles on which we conducted our foreign policy in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, and push principle, but particularly principle as expressed through law and agreements and treaties, as the basis for the way in which we all behave with respect to each other in the international community. So AUKUS is a sideshow, really.
Emma, just to wrap us up, if this conflict continues and escalates, do you think it's inevitable that Australia follows the United States into it?
Nothing is inevitable, but I do think that the weight of history suggests that Australia would follow the United States into an escalated conflict. And, it's important, as Allan pointed out, to say that, AUKUS doesn't necessarily influence that. The AUKUS submarine deal is a symptom, I think, rather than a cause of the ills of Australia's relationship with the United States, which has involved Australia following the United States into almost every war it has fought since the end of the Second World War, no matter when and no matter why, and doing so enthusiastically, often before even being asked by the United States. And I think it's worth returning even to the first Trump administration because, of course, Trump engaged in this kind of brinksmanship with Iran during his first administration when he ordered the assassination of the Iranian general Soleimani. And there were a few days there where it looked entirely possible that the United States would have started a renewed conflict with Iran. And it was clear then, under the Morrison government, that Australia would have followed the United States into that conflict. And it's evident from the statements coming out of the government, of the current government, that context still is very much alive, and momentum would always be towards Australian support for American militarism. But that isn't inevitable. It is still entirely possible for an Australian government to say no to that kind of conflict and to Australia being involved in that kind of conflict.
And indeed, I can remember it was Labor, although in opposition, who did speak out against following the United States into war with Iraq, which is quite recent history, really. So, yeah, as you said, not inevitable.
No, absolutely not inevitable. I mean, it would require significant political courage to not follow the United States into that kind of conflict, and it would involve, a pile-on, of course, from much of the Australian media and much of the right wing or the ideological right wing of Australian politics. But I think, the polling we were talking about before suggests that there would be support within the Australian community for saying no to following, President Trump, of all people, into that kind of conflict. But again, it would be a brave choice, and it would be a historically unusual choice.
Allan, is there an alternative to just once again blindly following the United States into conflict?
Ebony, I think that we can do quite a lot to help the United States sometimes get out of problems that it creates for itself. And it's worth bearing in mind that Australia's got quite a long and very recognisable and I think valuable history of support for UN peacekeeping measures, so that if we are to achieve a ceasefire in the Middle East, we should be advocating a monitoring capacity to make sure that the ceasefire is actually observed. We've been doing that in the Middle East certainly since Malcolm Fraser's time in the early 80s, when we joined the Multinational Force and Observers, the MFO, which is still there, by the way, smaller than it used to be, but monitoring the border between Israel and Egypt. So it is entirely possible for us to make a properly UN-based contribution, which is in the interest not just of the US, but of the total Middle Eastern community. That's where I think we should be exercising our diplomacy.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but thank you, Emma, and thank you, Allan.
Thanks, Eb.
Thank you.
You can sign the Australia Institute's petition calling on the Australian Government to launch a parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS by tapping the link in the show notes. And if you like the work we do at the Australia Institute, please consider supporting our end of financial year appeal. By donating today, you can double your impact. We've had one generous donor offer to match all donations dollar for dollar until we reach our goal of $70,000 before 30th of June. All donations over $2 are tax deductible, and you can donate today by visiting our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or following the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 24th of June, and some things may have changed since recording. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.